is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. And Muhammad is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours. But Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. And Muhammad is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours. But Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. And Muhammad is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours. But Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours.
Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries. And we've got guests all the way from the state tonight, because we are going to figure out how Muslims make their babies or how Allah helps them to make their babies. It's supposed to be very basic, but it seems something happened along the way by the time it ended up in the Quran. So Brother Theodos is going to explain that to us, unpack for us, and then give us critical view of it, how kind of Islam messed up. That's what I am hoping. I am hoping he's not going to say like, this is how Islam is true or something. We will hopefully come to conclusion. This is one of the reasons why Islam is false because I haven't seen his PowerPoints. You never know. You never know. Peace of Christ be with you, brother. How are you?
I'm doing well. And yeah, we're going to take a honest look at what the Quran has to say about embryology. Muslims tell us that this is one of the scientific miracles. It's probably the granddaddy of them all, if you will. It's the thing that kind of inspired people to start looking for these things. They're going to claim that the Quran contains advanced knowledge about how babies are developed in the womb. So we're going to take that claim seriously, put it to the test, and see if it holds up to scrutiny. I mean, I don't want to give away the end result, but you do see I still have a cross in my background, and I am wearing a t-shirt with a cross on it. So you might be able to guess that I'm not very impressed by the
Okay,
miracle.
you are not convinced. So you said this is one of the arguments on the scientific miracles of the Quran as the granddaddy of all. From my experiences, I know all the granddad dies. I am assuming by the end of this live stream, we will kind of make sure this argument is dead and buried, and we will all come together for the janazah. Brother, what have you been up to? How has life been with you?
Yeah, I've been busy as of late, both on and off of YouTube. Off YouTube, it's kind of the end of the year push to get things done at work before the end of the calendar year, before the last couple weeks where a lot of people are off, for holidays and whatnot. So not much happens those last 2 weeks or so of the year. So you got more stuff in the start of December that you got to get done. And then on YouTube, I've had a busy week or two. David was on my channel on Monday. That was very exciting. That's the first time he's ever been on my channel. We discussed the future of Islam and Christianity, as well as his own plans, and kind of dealt
Why?
with this idea that Islam's the fastest growing religion.
Yeah, baby making is good. While you mentioned that you had David Wood, what happened to the website you set up, ihatehatun.com? Is it still
uh,
going?
yeah, it should still work.
Okay, so those of you who don't know, even in the body of Christ, we were told we must love one another. There is no other option. Like, I cannot love my brother and sister. My brother set up a website called ihatehatun.com or something. Check that out. It should be fun for those of you who want to find the more reasons to hate me. Come alongside of the brother. On a serious note. So you had live stream with David Wood. What else? What else has been happening on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I've also done a couple videos on Andrew Tate, the new great proof of the truth of Islam that Andrew Tate has converted to Islam. So I did two videos on him. I did one, well, they're both mocking, of course, but the one I did as a Muslim, where I celebrated how he was correctly following the Sunnah, how he was for abusing women and such, and thus he was right in the line with Muhammad. And then the second one, I addressed his tweet or retweet technically, where someone called him God and he retweeted it. So thus he was
Yeah.
claiming to be God. And that one I called Super Shirk Brothers. I did it as a Mario theme with Tate and Muhammad being the two Shirk brothers. They both like to commit shirk.
It's amazing that Islam needs such a people to rescue it. Didn't work well, but I've seen his on social media. There was I think it was on Twitter or something. There was his profile picture, and he was like half naked in his profile picture. So no one told him to like dress modestly yet. So, anyway, just no good. Those of you who are joining us in the chat, it's good to have you. If you want to get our attention, please put @ in front of DCCI Ministries, and I gently encourage you to keep your conversations on the topic which we are discussing so that everyone can benefit. And as always, please do not use anyone's personal details in the chat, as well as do not copy and paste the same message again and again. I don't have that much rules and principles for the chat, but if you cross one of those probably you will be timed out. So we are intentional to not block people. Don't kind of abuse my moderators. At the end, they are told by God to love everyone. So don't push them. Don't push them. Okay, brother, I'll pass it on to you. You tell us what you have, and then if there are questions, I'll jump in, and then we take it from there, if that's okay with you.
Excellent. So you can go ahead and share the slides. We're going to be discussing embryology in the Quran. This is a lot of the scientific miracle claims, these claims that the Quran contains advanced scientific knowledge. They're really simple, really brief. That that's not they're a positive or a negative. They're just don't take a lot of time to address. Whereas embryology has multiple layers. So we're going to kind of look at multiple different layers of this claim. But let's start off with the claim. This comes from Sabaha Sadat. He is a medical doctor. He's an actual doctor, practicing doctor, unlike, say, Zakir Naik. And he published this article in a legitimate scientific journal, the International Journal of Health and Sciences. Now, it is published by Qasim University, which is one of Saudi Arabia's major universities. So, there might be a little bit of bias in them publishing this, but it is a legitimate journal that actually does peer review and stuff. So I figure this is probably the best article that could be made. This is the best attempt to justify the claims of embryology in the Quran. So we're going to be looking at the best argument we could find. He writes, man's quest to know about his origin has led him to search his roots, and the best source for him has been a religious scripture. The greatest miracle is the Holy Quran. There is an elegant description of origin, development, and step-by-step development stages of intrauterine life in the Quran. Muslims had this knowledge in the 7th century, and the Prophet Muhammad's ahadith, sayings, deeds, approvals narrated by authentic narrators, had explained almost everything about natal and even postnatal events. These findings, once presented to experts in the field of anatomy and embryology, surprised them, and they believed that the knowledge given to Prophet Muhammad was indeed divine. Who else would provide his knowledge to the Prophet Muhammad except the Creator himself? So obviously we'll get into the specifics of his claim, but he's laying out his case here. He's saying that everything he's about to say about the verses of the Quran, basically that they prove that Muhammad must have been having contact with the divine creator, or else he couldn't have possibly known these things. So that's the gist of his claim.
Okay, let me just kind of understand a couple of things. So Quran is, according to Islamic tradition, according to Muslim claims, is 7th century book. It is the revelation of Allah to Angel Gabriel, who passed it to the Muhammad. Claim is, we know Quran is from Allah because there are informations in the Quran only Allah could know. Muhammad wouldn't be able to know in 7th century Arabia. Therefore, we should be trusting the Quran and then put our faith on it. And then this proper medical doctor is stating Allah chooses to reveal himself and then these informations to man called Muhammad in 7th century. Even though in the Quran, Allah identifies Quran as well-detailed, well-explained book, we also read it from there. There are individuals kind of unpacks for us and then makes this well-detailed book little bit more detailed and full by putting certain narrations, putting certain stories to unpack what Allah meant to say in, let's say, 7th century. So overall, if you find something for us that within the Quran, it is, in this occasion, let's say, medically wrong, am I right to come to the conclusion that Quran cannot be the divine revelation from Allah?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, if you're going to claim that having accurate medical or scientific knowledge proves that it is from God, then likewise having inaccurate medical or scientific statements would prove it's not from God.
Okay. By the way, thank you for expressing this is proper medical doctor, because we recently kind of went through one of the medical doctor who was telling very, very non-medical things. So it's good that we know this guy is sound.
Yeah, I mean, as near as I can tell, he works as a surgeon, I believe, at an actual hospital, and he
Okay.
actually practices medicine. He's not a Muslim apologist. He's not written anything else in favor of Islam. So
Okay.
we will see that he does kind of play fast and loose a little bit with the science, but as far as his actual background, yeah, he's a legitimate medical professional.
Okay.
So before we get into the specifics, I want to ask why Christians should care about this, or why non-Muslims in general should care about this. And it's a good question, because usually when people look at these claims, they're like, they read the verse, they see the claim, and they're like, those don't match up. Why should I bother even responding? It's obvious that you're just making stuff up. And thus they don't put any effort into refuting these things. The problem is that Muslims really do value these things. Like, this is one of the main arguments that's made internally in the Muslim world, giving Muslims confidence in the truth of their scriptures, that supposedly science has confirmed the Quran, and thus it has to be what Muslims believe it to be, and that it's a word of God, because otherwise a human being couldn't write that. So what other explanation is there other than that God wrote it? So because this is so important to Muslims, and they're taught this from birth, and because it's one of the very few positive arguments for Islam, I think we need to take it on. We need to take it seriously, even though our intuition is that these arguments are ridiculous, that no one would believe them. And they may not convince anyone to convert to Islam, but they definitely give confidence to Muslims. And if we allow that confidence to go unchallenged, then other arguments we make, such as the immorality of Muhammad, aren't as effective, because someone could always look at Muhammad and say, yeah, I'm really uncomfortable with the fact that he had sex with a 9-year-old girl, but if God told him to do it, I guess I have to accept it. So you can attack Islam from either, but if you attack it from both, it's a lot stronger criticism, I would say. So before we get to Sadat's claims, let's just lay out the verses. There's three main places in the Quran that people will go to look for embryology. There's a couple related verses that might be used to explain things or add some details, and we'll look at those as needed. But the main ones that they go to, of course, 23:12 through 14. And I'm just going to use the Sahih International today. It's not always a perfect translation. They sometimes intentionally change things, but good enough for today's purpose, and it's the most popular English translation, so that's a good place to start. And indeed, certainly did we create man from an extract of clay. Then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump, and we made the lump bones. And we covered the bones with flesh, and we developed him from another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. 22:5 says similar things in slightly different words. O people, if we should be in doubt about the resurrection, then indeed we created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clinging clot, and then from a lump of flesh, formed and unformed, that we may show you. And we settle in the wombs, whom we will for a specified term. Then we bring you out as a child. And finally, a briefer statement in Surah 40, verse 67. It is he who created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clinging clot, then he brings you out as a child. So these verses have in common that there's some sort of sequence going on. And this is where the Muslim's going to claim some miraculous knowledge, that this sequence described in the Quran supposedly matches up with modern understanding, and that no one could have known that in the 7th century. Any first thoughts from you, Hatun?
Actually, I am not very good with biology. That was never my focus. I'm very curious to kind of figure out how Allah makes the babies, especially Islamic babies. It seems like they are very much unique. The way they come out. Nothing personal in here. I don't have any problem. Like, I have seen Muslim woman give birth to a child. I'm just like curious the way how Islamic babies are developing in the tummy. Maybe that's the reason why Muslims don't ask that much questions. I don't know. It seems right now steps are a little bit wrong. Nothing
Yeah,
personal.
I think that, we might find that they don't really match up. And we're going to go through it one stage at a time, getting Sadat's claim about each stage and taking a look at them. Looks like in the chat, Roman asked about the term resurrection there used in Surah 22. And he asked, isn't that a Christian belief? Well, that's one possibility. The Quran may derive from misunderstanding of Christian theology. But here it's referring to the day of resurrection in Muslim theology, where people are brought back for judgment. So it's referring to, if you have doubts about the last days, if you have doubts about what Allah is going to do in the end times and put people in Jannah or in hell, then just think about your own creation. Think about how you were created. And isn't that miraculous? So shouldn't you believe in Allah? So it actually is making a very important claim, that it's saying that you should look at this and you should see that Allah is at work, which actually is congruent with the Muslim claim, right? They're saying that they to look at these verses and see that Allah has done something miraculous here. They're not saying just by creating you. They're saying, and it matches up with later discoveries about science. So actually, it makes it even better sign than what the people of Muhammad's time would have seen.
Quran is supposed to be a book, according to its claim, to confirm the Bible. So what seems happening is, like, out of the Quran hears certain terms, and they don't know what to make of it, how to make sense of it. So Muhammad takes the responsibility, or Allah takes the responsibility, to unpack and justify it, and then they come up with like pretty mess thing. I think if they were simply confirming or taking the information from the Bible and putting into the Quran, that would be okay. But when they decided to touch and then transform that information to make something else, that's where it messed up, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, not the subject for today, but the author of the Quran, whether we call that Allah or not, seems to want to confirm Christian theology, but he doesn't seem to actually understand Christian theology. And thus we get these very confused statements.
That's why we say, welcome to the world of Islam.
All right. So let's, before we get into the claim of Sadat, we also need to lay out some criteria, because if these are going to be signs for us to trust the Quran, then we need something more than just our subjective opinion. We need some objective criteria to test them. So I have 5 criteria. I'll just go over them briefly. We have a previous stream, Hatun and I have a previous stream on scientific miracles where I explained them in more depth, but I just want to review them here. So the first criteria is that the insight must actually be true. And seems really obvious, right? It seems really obvious that if you're going to claim that science backs the Quran, that you better get the science right. But often these claims don't even manage to get the science right. Second criteria is that it must go beyond what could be observed with 7th century technology. So if a normal human being living in the 7th century could observe something, even if it's true, even if it's correct and matches modern scientific understanding, that doesn't require any divine intervention. It doesn't require any divine knowledge to observe something using technology in your eyes and whatnot. So the third criteria is that the claimed knowledge must be new to the Quran. The Quran, in reality, it borrows from previous existing texts, but we don't even need to make that assumption. We can pretend that the Quran isn't borrowing from anything, and I think in the cases of embryology, it's generally not directly borrowing from a text. It's just repeating ideas that existed at the time. But the point here isn't that the author of the Quran was reading Galen, for example, and copying Galen's ideas and putting them in the Quran. The point is that if a human being came up with it, even if there's no possibility that a human being in some other time and place came up was directly influential on Muhammad. The point is, if a human being came up with it before, then a human being could come up with it again, and we don't need any divine intervention to explain how the idea came to be. The fourth criteria is the most important because this is where the miracle happens, the miracle of reinterpretation. The Muslim will take the known science and then they'll pretend that the Quran says what they want it to say. So we need a way to test whether the Quran actually says what the apologist claims, and to avoid, debating back and forth. I think it means this, you think it means that. I suggest that we look at the classical tafsir. Now, does every single tafsir have to say the same thing? No. But if it actually says something, one of these faithful Muslims who are considered the best scholars of Islam in its history, they better have seen that interpretation. Because if they didn't see that interpretation in the verses, it's not there. You can't use it as evidence if no one ever saw it until after the science was known. And then finally, it must go beyond a lucky guess. So if there's only two possibilities, and there's no possible way that someone in the 7th century can know which of those two is correct, it's still, 50-50 guess. And you could easily get it right just by pure chance. So failing to meet one of these criteria doesn't necessarily prove the information's wrong. It doesn't necessarily prove that the Quran is false, although we will see there are some false statements in it. It just means it can't be used as evidence of divine knowledge. If Muhammad makes a statement that's something that's very obvious and it is true, that doesn't mean that the Quran is false. It just means that you can't use it as evidence. It fails the second criteria, for example. Any comments on these criteria?
Well, I think those are good criteria. We only need to put them in test. And I believe you did so. So let's see what we have there.
All right.
It is. I think one of the things for me is like how Muslims can easily pick and choose when it comes to which criteria they are going to follow. So therefore, we end up like a little bit more criteria than Muslims have.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that they'll look at it and they'll say it's obvious. Well, it's obvious isn't an argument. That's a subjective opinion. If you want this to be evidence, you need something objective, not just your opinion.
Yeah, and
so briefly,
is affecting your eternity.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, everyone should want evidence. If these miracles, miracle's not really the best term, but if the scientific foreknowledge was actually true, then it should hold up to scrutiny. And if it's not actually true, then the Muslims should want to know that. They shouldn't just want to believe something because it's convenient for them. They should want to know what's actually true. So we'll briefly touch on what I call stage 0 here. I called it stage 0 because Sadat doesn't actually mention this, but some other Muslim apologists do. The first part of the passage in Surah 23 says, "And certainly we did create man from an extract of clay." So Sadat ignored it. Most Muslim apologists ignore it. But sometimes Muslims will take this and they'll say, well, you see, human beings have some of the same chemicals as clay do. So this is also a scientific miracle. That statement's nonsense. I mean, it's technically true that there's some chemicals that human beings and clay have in common, but any two objects pretty much are going to have some things in common. The proportion of the so-called essential chemicals of life in clay is very different than in a human being. There doesn't seem to be any real correlation between those two. But I think it is fair to ignore this particular point in evaluating the scientific claim here, because I do think that it is actually plausible that the Quran intends this to be a description of the creation of Adam rather than every single human being. Ibn Kathir, for example, supports this. He says that the verse means that Allah tells us how he initially created man from the extract of tin. This was Adam, peace be upon him, whom Allah created from sounding clay of altered black smooth mud. Ibn Jair said Adam was called tin because he was created from it. Qadaya said Adam was created from tin. This is the more apparent meaning and is closer to the context, for Adam, peace be upon him, was created from a sticky tin, which is which is a sounding clay of altered black smooth mud, and it's created from dust. So the author of the Quran could have been clear that he was referring to Adam, but the imagery's there. Adam is described as being made from clay elsewhere. So I think it is plausible, and I think it is fair to skip over that point. So we'll go ahead and start looking at the actual claims of Mr. Sadat here. So his first stage is what he calls the drop stage, or the nutfa stage. From verse 13, then we placed him as a sperm drop, which is what nutfa is, in a firm lodging. Sadat, explaining why this is a miraculous claim, writes the following. Nutfa amshaj. Nutfa means a drop, and amshaj means mixtures. This term describes the mixture and convergence of male and female fluids in the uterine or fallopian tubes to form zygote. It has the form of a drop of fluid and consists of a mixture of male and female secretions. The nutfa amshaj can be subdivided into stage 1.1, the Kalk stage. When the male and female secretions meet, they may or may not form a conceptus or a zygote. If a zygote is formed with 46 chromosomes, a new being will be produced. This process of formation of a single individual by fusion of two secretions has been aptly named Kalak. So first of all, note that he's called this the Nutfa Amshaj stage, but the word Amshaj isn't in this passage. It's not in Surah 23. He's imported that without stating so from Surah 76, verse 2, which states, "Indeed, we created man from a sperm drop mixture that we may try him, and we made him hearing and seeing." So already he's having to clarify the words of Allah. At least in this case, he went to another Quran verse for clarification, but he has added that. And note also that he's imported the word kalk from verse 14. He's going to suggest that there's a stages here, but he's went ahead and took the word that comes much later in the passage and imported it here where he could make it make more sense.
So just for me to understand it. So Surah 23, which kind of Muslim apologists used to express how Quran must be the word of Allah because Muhammad in 7th century wouldn't know the stages of the baby. Now Muslims are kind of debating within themselves what is that Arabic word mean, the one like Muslims turn to every time. Apparently some Muslims are trying to figure out what is that word even mean.
Yeah, and we're going to see that, he's going to pull out several particular words, starting with this drop or sperm, and the kind of the miracle, if you will, comes in how you decide what that word means.
Yeah.
We'll look we'll look at what the ancient commentators thought it meant, and in this case they do actually think it means sperm, but he's adding the mixing here from Surah 76, plus he's written a couple paragraphs, and there's actually going to be more that he writes about this one word on the next slide. He's taken these couple words and he's added all this stuff which it doesn't seem to describe at all. Like he writes uterine or fallopian tubes to form a zygote. Where's that in this? It's nowhere. All it says is we placed a sperm drop in a firm lodging. So continuing on with still this same verse, still these same 6-8 words, he says stage 1.2 is the takdir stage. The human creation begins with formation of a zygote, but what are its characteristics? What will it inherit from the father and what from the mother? This process takes place a few hours after the kalak phase. The Holy Quran called it takdir phase, and modern scientists call it genetic programming. The takdir in Arabic means planning, determining, or programming. Very similar indeed. The Quran indicates that these processes occur in immediate succession, and we know that these processes are completed less than 30 hours after fertilization. The process of sex determination takes place in this stage. The Quran states in Surah An-Najm, which is Surah 53, this is verses 45 and 46. And he did create two sexes, the male and female, from the nutfa when emitted or planned. This seems to be his own translation. There is no justification for putting planned in that verse. Every translation I looked at just says emitted, and the word takdir is not in that verse. So I actually have no clue where he got the idea that this stage should be called takdir, other than his imagination, I suppose. We know that if the sperm with an a Y chromosome fertilizes the ovum, it is a male child. If a sperm bearing an X chromosome fertilizes an ovum, it is a female child. So what is actually takdir in Islamic theology? That was a question for you.
Oh, I don't know.
So takdir is Allah's decree. You can find it mentioned in Surah 696, 25:2, 36:38, 41:12, 76:16. None of these verses have anything to do with embryology or creation or formation of human beings or anything like that. They're all about how if Allah decrees something, it happens. So I cannot figure out, I did my best to figure out why he's calling it the takdir phase and how he's justifying that, but I couldn't do it. He doesn't give any reason to do it. So we'll just have to leave that as a mystery.
Someone is asking, since this is the stage 1, someone is asking if they missed the egg part.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Not like egg omelette, not boiled egg stuff. This is like different egg. I think people know the context, but person is saying if they missed it.
Yeah, I mean, if we're the words of the Quran just say we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. It sounds to me like you take the sperm and you put it in the womb, the uterus, and that's all there is to it. It doesn't seem to suggest anything about a sperm fertilizing an egg.
Yeah, so Islam doesn't think egg is important. That's okay. We let that go. We let that go.
And there might be a reason for that, because sperm can be observed in the 7th century. The female's egg cannot be observed in the 7th century. Strangely, the author of the Quran only knows about what can be observed.
They probably only know how to boil egg or how to make like omelets. So they didn't know. They didn't know. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, brother. Sorry.
So believe it or not, that actually wasn't the end. He actually has even more to say about these 6 or 8 words.
Okay.
He says that stage 1.3 is the hearth stage. When the phases of Kalk and Takdir are completed, the zygote migrates from the fallopian tube to the uterus, where it implants itself similar to a seed planting in soil. It gets embedded in the intramendium and receives its nourishment and develops a different shape and structure. It is mentioned in the Quran that intramendial lining of the uterus is similar to the soil in which a seed is embedded. During this stage, the real settlement begins, and it is described in the Prophet's hadith. The angel enters upon the conceptus, which is a different translation for the same word, the nutfa. He's saying it's conceptus. Earlier I said it was sperm. Those are not the same thing. After it rests in the uterus for 40 or 45 nights. So, couple questions for you. First of all, do you have any guess as to why he might say that the Quran describes the intramendial lining as soil?
Before that, can I ask a practical question?
Yes, sure.
So this is the second slide of just we are trying to figure out what is that word means.
Mm-hmm.
In very basic language. So what is the author is trying to tell us with this? What is this word means? Like, why do they need to write just essay on one word if it is like so clear? I'm just trying to make sense of it. So in my level, let's say 0 biology, what so far what did you what did you shared with us?
Yeah, well, we'll ask the question whether this is true or not in a minute, but basically, I think that he's taken a bunch of more or less accurate, maybe not quite accurate, but more or less accurate science, and then just pretended that this verse has all this stuff in it. As far as I can tell, all the verse says is that Allah takes a sperm drop and places it in the womb. So the author, Sadat here, is using his imagination, as near as I can tell.
Okay. Answer to your question, is it has to do anything with Surah 2? Your wives are tilt. You go to your tilt, however, whenever you want, so you can like sew them.
Yeah, I think that must be what he has in mind. He doesn't specify,
Okay.
probably because he don't want to look up that verse. So we will look at how the commentators took that verse, but I'm pretty sure that's probably what he's referring to, because it's the only place where anything remotely like describing a woman as soil takes place.
Yeah.
And then my other question is, are you familiar with this hadith that he refers here, where the angel...
I was gonna check that. Is that the one like how in 40 days your gender is being decided? Is that one?
No, it doesn't actually. It's not the one where Muhammad claims whoever orgasms first will determine the sex of the child. However, it does have some other very interesting information. I think that he doesn't quote, he just says that it's in Muslim. I think he's probably...
Yeah, you've got Sahih Muslim, 6392 says, when the drop of remains in the womb for 40 or 50 days or 40 nights, the angel comes and then says, my Lord, will he be good or evil? And both those things would be written. Then the angel says, my Lord, will he be male or female? Both of those things are written. And his deeds and his actions, his death, his lifehood, those are all recorded. Then his document of destiny is ruled, and there is no addition to it. So that's Sahih Muslim 6392. So where angel comes and then do the qadar, writes your does the predestination, so what you are going to do, all that good or evil, and then also names you, like genders you, are you going to be male or female? Is that the one?
And so that's what I had was 2643, but I think that it's either different numbering or it's the same basic hadith in two different places, because it does speak of Allah, or sorry, the angel coming and then asking Allah whether the child should be male or female, and among other things. There's a couple related hadith. I think he was probably technically alluding to 2643b, because that one's much shorter.
Okay.
And it just says the creation one of you is like that. Semen is collected in the womb of the mother for 40 nights. However, that one, if he is referring only to that, then he's being deceptive, because it's called B because it's related to A, and A has the full story that he didn't want to quote. He didn't want to quote all that other stuff where it says that the lump of flesh becomes bones and well, actually, here, I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, the constitutes of one of you is collected for 40 days in the mother's womb in the form of blood, after which it becomes a clot of blood. So notice the clot of blood, at least according to Sahih Muslim, according to Muhammad, the best interpreter of the Quran, stays blood and doesn't become a clot until 40 days. Then it becomes a lump of flesh, and 40 days later, Allah sends his angel to it and instructions concerning 4 things. And so the angel writes down livelihood, his death, his deeds, his fortune, and misfortune. And there was actually 2645 that the angel specifically asks if they're male or female.
Yeah, just also the quick side note, sorry. I'm just thinking to use it as well. The hadith reference I read, Sahih Muslim 6000, what was that? 6392. In that, like, when angel comes, and then first question is like, my Lord, will he be good or evil? That's already been decided, okay? While you are in the womb, angel and Allah decides if you are going to be evil. Like, just like think
Yeah, I
about it.
mean,
Just
going
think.
back to this supposed tech deer phase, that's what the Quran teaches. It teaches that Allah determines everything about you before you're born. He determines whether you're going to be a good Muslim and obey Him, or you're going to be a bad person and disobey. And then He creates you that way. You have no choice in it. It's His decree. You can't get around it. And then He punishes you if He decided arbitrarily that you would be one of the people who disobeyed.
Yeah. So just also another quick side note. This has nothing to do with the biblical understanding of predestination. So Islamic understanding of predestination is this qadar thing is like very much disturbing. Anyway, continue, brother.
Yep. So we're finally through with his claim about these few words. So let's go ahead and analyze his claims. So we first have to ask, is his claim true? And the best I can say for him is sort of. So he's clearly trying to make the Quran fit the science rather than the other way around. Like he's not trying to distort the science necessarily, but he can only twist the Quran so far, so he has to twist the science a tiny bit as well. When he describes mixing of fluids, that's not a good description at all of the fertilization process. In reality, a single sperm fertilizes a single egg by penetrating the cell membrane of the egg. There is no mixing of fluids. There is a mixing of fluids, but there's no mixing of fluids that causes a baby to be conceived. The baby being conceived is not directly from the mixing of male and female reproductive fluid. It's from a sperm penetrating an egg. So if the Quran is written by an all-knowing God and He wants us to have this knowledge that no one could have at the time, He should have described the drop penetrating an egg. He should not have said, I take a drop and I put it in a firm lodging.
Okay, can I just challenge something?
Yes.
Sorry. You said this gentleman, what was his name? Sabiha Sadat is a medical doctor. I just wanted to make sure, like, is that still correct?
Yeah, it's correct.
Okay.
I'm not in his head. I don't know what he was thinking when he wrote this, but I think he was probably knowing that he was twisting things a tiny bit.
Okay. Because like the terms medical doctor would use, even if you are teaching basics to child, will be very much different, and you wouldn't use, as you also express in your slide, mixing of fluids, like such a words. But anyway, I'll let that go.
Yeah, I mean, he had to at least make it sort of related to the Quran, so he did his best. He did his best to make it sound like something that came from the Quran. However,
if anyone lives in Saudi Arabia part of the world, or if anyone knows this doctor, please don't go to him. I can at this stage I can advise, don't go to him as a patient. Yes, brother.
Yeah, and the part about him adding in the hadith, that's just clearly false. I mean, there's nothing happens at the 40-day stage related to what he said. He just made life difficult for himself by choosing to include that. I'll let it go since we're discussing whether the Quran contains scientific miracles, but it was a really dumb choice because that hadith is a nightmare. He does not want to be going to that hadith. The science is terrible. So, yeah, like I said, let's give him a pass. He could just rewrite his description. He could rewrite his description to be more scientifically accurate and remove that unnecessary reference to the hadith. So we'll give him a pass, even though it wasn't that accurate. I don't think he'd pass a freshman medical class with that kind of language. So is this observable? Well, if we're talking about the mixing of sexual fluids, then yeah, you can observe that. I mean, kind of obvious. You can use your eyes. If we're talking about every single thing that he claims about what the Quran says, which is technically what we're analyzing, then no, it's not observable. So we can say that not everything was observable in the 7th century. the X chromosome, for example. He talked about the X and Y chromosome. That obviously wasn't observable. That obviously isn't in the Quran either. But hey, it's not observable, so it passes that criterion.
Yeah,
So is this?
you would expect such a basic information if the Allah is the author of the Quran to actually share that information, share that knowledge with Muhammad. But yeah, he doesn't do that. 21st century medical doctors are trying to make sense of what Allah meant in 7th century.
Yeah, it's interesting how everything that Sadat will put in his article that is not observable in the 7th century, that's true, isn't found in the Quran. And everything that's observable, that is true or false, is found in the Quran. Very interesting conclusion. So we have to ask, is this an original idea? Did the author of the Quran come up with this? If it's God, obviously he'd have knowledge that human beings wouldn't have.
Sorry, I just like things are just coming to my mind. Sorry. So you talked about this 40-day stages in previous PowerPoints.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got like Muslim scholars who is talking about like how babies how women can be pregnant for like 5 years to 10 years. When it comes to like over 9 months, I don't know exactly how many days like woman is pregnant, but like when it comes to over 9 months, let's say 11 months, is this 40-day stages are changing, or they're just like still at the same time, they are still 40 days, but just like babies like start growing tooth and learning how to walk in the tummy? Any comments on that? I'm just being sarcastic.
Yeah, good question. Pregnancies can occasionally, very, very, very rarely last longer than 9 months, or I should say like 9.5, to be fair. But certainly never, multiple years. and it, how do these 40 days work? I guess you just extend the last stage. I don't know. I mean, if it happens at 40 days or 40 to 45 days, depending on which hadith you're looking at, then that means 40 to 45 days, right? So
you would expand the latest stage. So that means like, yeah, babies start like learn how to walk in the tummy stuff. Okay, got that. Yep.
I mean, it's my best guess. I don't know how you justify it in Islam. So is this an idea that's new to the Quran? And did any human being come up with this idea before? Well, remember what the Quran says is we placed a drop in a firm or safe lodging. So this idea sounds exactly what Aristotle believed in. It was a common belief that the semen was basically a fully formed human being that was just super, super, super duper tiny. And then it came out of the man, went into the woman, and then it grew. That was basically common belief at the time. Aristotle writes, now it is impossible that any creature should produce 2 seminal secretions at once. And the secretion of the females, which answers to semen in males, is the menstrual fluid. It obviously follows that the female does not contribute any semen to generation. So Aristotle's theory was that women contributed menstrual blood, and that the semen, which is kind of a fully formed person, fed on the menstrual blood and it grew from there. Obviously, he's way wrong, but it's very similar to the Quran's idea. You take the semen, the seed, you place it in its lodging and it grows. Very compatible with what the Quran says. If we grant the mixing and we say that both the male and the female contribute to the genetic makeup of the child, which again, questionable, but if we grant that, then it matches the idea of Hippocrates, who said, in fact, both partners alike contain both male and female sperm. The male being stronger than the female must originate from a stronger sperm. Here is a further point. If both partners produce a strong sperm, then male is the result. So he goes on to describe how you determine, which of the two partners. It could be the male was dominant. It could be the females was dominant. It could be that they're equal mix. Again, complete nonsense in terms of actual scientific terms, but this is his theory. And hey, it matches up with the Quran if we grant that mixing is taking place. You have two fluids, they mix together, and something occurs between those two fluids, and that determines what the child looks like, or what genetic material the child has.
So it is talking about like both gender is to produce sperm.
Yeah, yeah. So
Like male
Hippocrates
and
thought,
female.
yeah, not only that, he thought that there was a distinctive male sperm and a distinctive female sperm, and he thought that both males and females produced both of them, and so if the male produced a male sperm and the female produced a male sperm, then you'd get a male child. If they both produced female sperm, then you'd get a female child. If it was mixed, then there was a fight that took place, and the winner was determined, and that's how the child was. Yeah,
Maybe
it's kind of silly, but it's what he believed.
maybe they are just giving the hints of transgender agenda this stage.
Yeah, it could be. Could be. So we next have to ask, does the Quran teach it? So there's kind of two questions here. One, does the Quran teach mixing of fluids? Two, does it teach the sperm being placed in the womb? And then three, does it teach all the other stuff that Sadat said? So rather than going, he had like, I don't know, 10 or 15 different things that he claimed that the verse was saying. So instead of like going through point by point and saying, nope, the tafsir don't teach that, let's just look at what the tafsir actually do teach. So Ibn Kathir, writing on 2312, just says that it's placed in the womb. He just says that the drop is placed in the womb, basically repeats what the Quran says. On 76.2, he does explicitly state that the male and female fluids mix, so we can give the Quran credit for saying mixing takes place. That's all we can conclude safely from Ibn Kathir. Al-Tabari says that the sperm reaches a safe place in the womb, so he probably was imagining the sperm traveling, so he got a little bit more correct, but he's still thinking that the sperm just goes into the womb and grows. On 76.2, he says that there are many different interpretations of this verse. This perfectly clear Quran verse that explains itself in detail. There's many different Islamic scholarly interpretations of what it means. He does say that the mixing of male and female fluids is preferred, but he lists that other people believe that male or female fluid becomes dominant, kind of like Hippocrates there, where they fight it out, and one of them wins, and then they determine the sex of the child. Or he says it might also refer not to the mixing of male and female reproductive fluids, but the mixing of blood and water. Kurtubi on 2312 just says that it's sperm, and he doesn't say anything else. He doesn't have any of those fantastic interpretations of Sadat. On 76.2, he says it might be the mixing of the man's fluid, or he says it is the mixing of four things: the man's fluid, the woman's fluid, that's a typo, it should say fluid, the woman's blood, and a blood clot. So all those things mixed together to create a child, according to Al-Qurtubi, under inspiration of what the Quran has to say. Finally, we should also look at Surah 2, 223, since Sadat brought that up. All the tafsir talk about the same thing. They all say that this verse is about the permissibility of different sexual positions. It has nothing to do with how a child's determined or about a woman being, her uterine lining being like soil. They just say it's about sexual positions, and they say that a woman being is a place to grow your crops, or put nicer, a place to grow your baby. But there is nothing about any soil. That's entirely his imagination.
Okay. So for one word, very interesting and unique opinions to try to make sense of what Allah said in his word.
Yep. Allah seems perfectly clear to me, at least in this verse. He seems to say that he's taking a sperm and he's placing it in the womb. But that's not correct, so you got to use your imagination. You got to find other things to talk about. So our last criteria, is this a lucky guess, or could this be a lucky guess? Well, I mean, it's kind of obvious. I mean, how else would children be formed other than something related to sex? I'm sure ancient people were well aware that when they had sex, sometimes the woman got pregnant. So it doesn't seem like it's very hard to guess. And there's really only three possibilities. It could be the man alone providing the child, it could be the woman alone, or it could be both together. And as we've seen, arguably, the Quran offers two different possibilities. You know, Surah 23 seems to say that it's just the man's sperm, and Surah 76 seems to say it's the male and female fluids mixing together. So, yeah, looks like could easily be a lucky guess to me. Before I reveal my conclusion, what are your thoughts? Do you think this is a scientific miracle for stage 1?
I think this is the miracle of miracles. It is a miracle in a sense. Quran is well detailed, well explained book, and now we are looking at Surah 23 is one of the verse Muslim missionaries would go to make a case that Quran is divine. Yet, just we looked at one word, and I seriously at this stage, I'm not sure what is the meaning of the word, because medical experts and scholars and authors are trying to make sense of it, and you would expect by now they all come to conclusion and then burned everything disagrees with what they wanted to say, and then we've got only one version. But it just helps me to be just put my thinking face on, and not sure if I like to put my thinking face on simply just talking on only one of the most obvious, most famous verse on very famous verse which Muslim missionaries turn to. So I'm just nothing personal to you, brother. You've done great job, but you just made us a little bit more confused because we are just trying to find out the word first, and then we will figure out the biological steps. Just confusing.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the tafsir, they all think it's not confusing. They all think it means a sperm drop. Modern Muslims trying to make this into something correct, they can't figure out what it means. They have no clue what it means. Sadat himself offered 3 or 4 different meanings for the one word. And he wants us to not notice that he's changed it to whatever is most convenient for the sentence he's writing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree. There's no miracle here. It's just a vague statement in the Quran that conveys obvious knowledge. If you claim anything else, if you write 3 pages explaining this one word, you're just engaging in bad eisegesis, reading meaning into the text that is not actually there.
Would you say, anyway, I'll ask that question at the end. I'll ask that question.
Okay. So we didn't find any miracle in stage 1, but let's go ahead and see stage 2, because maybe there's some miraculous knowledge in here somewhere. Who knows?
But just a moment, brother. I am already disappointed with your statement, because you are hunting for knowledge, and you are digging and digging and digging and digging. It should be very obvious, since Allah decided to share His knowledge. Remember, in the first slide, you expressed that how Allah is revealing His knowledge to Muhammad. It should be just there. Everyone should be able to see it easily.
Yeah, I would think so too. I think if this was actually some kind of advanced knowledge that is supposed to tell us that God is the author of the Quran, then we should be able to read it, and we should instantly see that this is a very accurate, very detailed description of the production of children. We shouldn't need to go to some medical expert to tell us what all the medical knowledge is and pretend that the verse says that. We should see it in the verse.
Yeah.
Strangely, we don't do that. But again, be very generous. We'll continue on. We'll look at more, see what else this verse might have to say.
We are very generous because our God is very generous. We are just okay, maybe they made a mistake here, or maybe they are misrepresenting. Just in case.
Yes. Yep, just in case. Maybe the Quran does have some advanced knowledge in this passage, and Sadat just didn't get to the point. He wrote a bunch of other stuff first, and then he got to the advanced knowledge later on. So we'll continue on. Continuing on, verse 14, we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot. So stage 1, we place a sperm drop into the womb, or safe lodging, as the Quran says. And then stage 2, we turn it into a clinging clot. Sadat helps us out again by telling us what this verse actually means. He calls this the alaka phase. Alaka is the word translated as clot. The period begins on day 15 and is completed on day 23 or 24 when the embryo gradually acquires the shape of a leech. The Arabic word alaka has 3 meanings. It can mean leech, it can mean suspended thing, or it can mean blood clot. There's a great similarity between a freshwater leech and early embryo. The enclosed picture shows the similarity between the two. I'll pull up his picture here in a second. The second meaning is a suspended thing, and that is what we can see the way the embryo is attached to the placenta in this stage. Both these meanings describe and reflect accurately the external appearance of an embryo at this stage. The third meaning, the blood clot, describes the most important internal structure that affects the external appearance. For in alaka stage, blood is formed in the blood vessels in the form of isolated islands, and the embryo resembles a blood clot. Descriptions are given miraculously, in this single word, alaka. So let me go.
Ask some questions. Can I?
Yeah, I'm going to pull up his very fuzzy picture. This is actually he took a bad photograph of what appears to be a commentary on the Quran and put it in his article. I'll have a better picture in a second, but I thought I'd go ahead and pull that up while you're talking.
Yeah, I've got a similar picture as well. I am okay. You need to move your picture a little bit to the left or something.
Yeah, I'll go back.
Okay, so it might be your typing, because I don't think any of the Muslim scholars or medical experts will make a mistake. This might be your typing mistake. But the third line says, there is a great similarity between a freshwater leech to early embryo. Did I read that correct?
Yeah, you read that correct.
Okay,
and there actually are some typos in this. I copied and pasted. I don't know if it's a problem with the OCR or what, or if the mistakes are actually in the original. So I just left it as is.
Then I just thought it was funny, like how they are comparing that to fresh water.
Yeah. And you notice he puts the meaning of leech as primary. Probably because he thinks that's the one that's most miraculous. But if you just think about the word, well, first of all, it's almost always used for blood clot. And second of all, that makes sense why a animal that feeds on blood, that a word meaning blood clot could come to describe that animal in some contexts. It doesn't really make a lot of sense why a word meaning leech would come to also describe a blood clot, however. So I think that blood clot's certainly the primary meaning, and he even called it the clot stage, so he's acknowledging that's what it really means. But of course they have to go into this apology of it doesn't really mean blood clot, because that's going to be scientifically false. It means leech. Yeah, that's what it means.
So you just said, like, just think about that word for a bit. I don't want to think about that word, because medical experts thought about the word and then they came up with 3 different definitions and still they're not sure about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is technically true that those are possible definitions. But notice that this is a total abuse of the way language works. Words can have different meanings, but that doesn't mean they have all those meanings and every time they're used. They have one meaning each time they're used. One and only one. You don't use every meaning of a term.
I think that's your mistake, because we are talking about Allah, who is the one who makes the speech. So Allah is like so beautiful in his speech. Everything he says can be used in many different ways.
Which makes it perfectly clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. So here's his fuzzy picture. I don't know why he can't even figure out how to focus his camera properly, but no worries. I have a better picture from a different Muslim apologist website. You may not be able to tell or not, but here is the leech. Yeah. And if you look carefully, it is the same picture, but it's a different orientation because they're comparing it to a different drawing. A leech doesn't have much form. It's just kind of a blob. So if you compare it to a drawing, it's going to kind of look like it. You just find a blobby leech that looks like the blobby drawing, and you say, look, they resemble each other. That's how it works. So the question is this true? And the answer is not really. I mean, you're never going to find a medical textbook. You're never going to find a textbook on development of human beings or embryology or medicine in general that describes an early stage embryo as resembling a leech, because it's a stupid, pointless description. The only reason a Muslim goes to that is because they want to avoid the blood clot. They don't want it to be a blood clot because an embryo is not a blood clot. His second meaning, suspended, is questionable as well. It will eventually be true in the pregnancy that you could describe the developing baby as being suspended from the uterine lining, but it's not really accurate at this very early stage. It's basically attached to it or adhering to it. So suspended is a really poor choice to describe that. And then, as I have already mentioned multiple times, it's not a blood clot. No way, no form is an embryo a blood clot. So it's not looking good even from the science standpoint. But let's finish the questions. Is it observable? Well, yes, an early stage miscarriage closely resembles a blood clot. That's probably where the author of the Quran got the idea that a baby started off as a blood clot they observed, or others observed and they heard other people talking about it. They wouldn't have to directly observe it, but existing human knowledge of the time period from observing miscarried babies was that very early on the baby was a blood clot, because that's what it looks like when you have an early stage miscarriage. Here are a couple of photos of what an early stage embryo actually looks at. A very high-powered electronic microscope on the right, and it's probably the left for the audience, and a scientific drawing on the right. So neither one really looks much of anything like a leech, I will point out. But it is something that could be observed, that it looks like a blood clot. So is this idea original to the Quran? And again, the answer is probably not. Although I will say that no other term uses the term leech, so if that's actually what it meant, it would be unique in that description. Inaccurate, but unique at least. Aristotle says it follows that the female would contribute to the semen of the male, that what the female would contribute to the semen of the male would be material for the semen to work upon. Could be a description of the semen causing the menstrual blood to clot. You could get that out of his statement. He believes that the blood feeds the semen, but it's working upon it and causes it to clot. Perhaps, that could be an explanation. Hippocrates says, moreover, it grows because of its mother's blood, which descends from the womb. Growing on blood, kind of like a leech, kind of like a leech that sucks on blood to live. Interesting. Galen says, it was necessary, therefore, that the fetus adheres to the mother. Adheres is a much better description than is suspended, by the way, as the seed of the plant must adhere to the earth. Elsewhere, Galen refutes the idea that the child is formed from blood clot, i.e., he's taking on an idea that exists. It proves the idea exists. Some people were arguing that a child forms from a blood clot. Galen says, no, you're wrong. So he seems to know better than the author of the Quran in this case, because he knows that the child is not formed from a blood clot. And he did this several hundred years before the Quran was written. Finally, in the Talmud, which we know is in reality a major influence upon the Quran, it's stated that it may be inferred that the embryo clings to the sandal at the middle of the ladder. Again, clings to, adheres to, better description than is suspended from. So if the Quran is portraying advanced scientific knowledge by saying that the embryo is suspended from the uterine lining, then the Talmud seems to be even more miraculous because it gets it better. It describes it better with more precise term. Any thoughts you want to add?
I'm just like getting more confused. First of all, I'm just becoming more aware that why I shouldn't trust any human beings, even Aristotle, even Galen, because it seems they are all very much confused. Therefore, it is good that we've got the word of God kind of overrides it all. So, am I right to remember Galen is like from 2nd century?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So, Quran kind of while these informations are circulating, if Quran kind of stole some of those arguments and then put out of the Quran, stole it and then put it in the book called Quran in the language where caravan robbers can understand. From that perspective, it makes sense to me. Why would they come with such a words and such a definition? But also, I am double heartbroken. This is like so far we are only looking at the one verse, and we are trying to figure out what is nutfak means and what is alakat means. Those are the two Arabic terms which is mentioned in that one verse, and it just all confusing. Seems Allah didn't communicate well. Therefore, Muslim scholars or whoever kind of trying to unpack for us just tries to figure out what it is all about at the first place.
Yeah, if Allah was trying to convey some, now if Allah was just providing a generic description, then he's fine, But if he intends this to be a detailed description that is going to give Muslims in the 21st century confidence in the scientific accuracy of the Quran, he totally failed. If he's
So
just saying,
you are telling me Allah, even he said it is detailed, but Allah actually Muslims doesn't think that is detailed. Therefore, they are filling it up.
yes, that's what I'm telling you. If Allah is just saying in very basic terms that he develops human beings in stages, I can get that out of the verse. I cannot get out of the verse any claim about, all this medical detail that Sadat has come up with. So now we ask, does the Quran teach what Sadat said? Well, the answer is no, absolutely not, unless we want to go with the inaccurate blood clot meaning. That they do teach. Ibn Kathir says explicitly that the fluid turns into a blood clot. So you have the fluid of the sperm drop, possibly the fluid provided by the female. They turn into a blood clot, according to Ibn Kathir, under inspiration of what the Quran says. Al-Tabri describes it as a piece of blood, which is a pretty accurate description of what a blood clot is. Al-Qurtubi, he doesn't talk about al-Ka when he's talking about 23:14, but when he's 22:5, which is very close parallel, he calls it solid blood. Again, another very accurate description of a blood clot. So they all seem to think that the clot means clot. They think it's a blood clot. They think that Allah has turned a sperm into a blood clot. So finally, we have to ask, is this a lucky guess? Development could, in principle, occur in any order. A human being could develop the heart first, and the fingernails second, and bones third. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's a whole bunch of different orders that could take place. So if the author of the Quran got the order right, that would go beyond a lucky guess. So let's ignore that there is no blood clot stage. There's never any stage of human pregnancy that could be accurately described as a blood clot. And let's say it's a pass on the lucky guess criteria. So given all that, do you think that this second stage is conveying some advanced scientific knowledge?
No. Is the answer no?
Yes,
My
yes. The
answer is,
answer.
if my answer is wrong, that means you are not a good teacher.
Yeah, you're correct. There's no miracle here. All we have is a factually incorrect statement about blood clots. The modern apologists trying to make this into something else, into a leech or a hanging thing, demonstrate the error. They do not demonstrate that there's a miracle. They demonstrate that Allah chose the wrong word to describe this stage. Sadly, Allah is not looking so good. But
I was
Sadat's not ready.
I was reminded today that if you don't know something, just say I don't know, and then go and do your homework. It seems Allah kind of forget that very basic principle. He doesn't know, but he's forcing himself to share the information which he doesn't know. If the author of Quran is Allah, of course.
Yes, yeah, he doesn't know everything apparently, and then he is not humble enough to just admit that. He tries to make a guess and he gets it wrong. But Sadat's not ready to give up yet. He has a third stage for us, which is the Mudghah stage, corresponding to these words in verse 14. We made the clot into a lump. The translator has to clarify in the perfectly clear word by adding a flesh, because it really just says lump. It does not say flesh. They want it to mean flesh, so the translator adds flesh there, but it really just says a lump. So Mudghah means lump. Sadat writes, the second stage is the Mudghah, which means a chewed substance. The embryo changes from alaqah to Mudghah stage at 24 to 26 days. The word Mudghah means something that has been chewed by size, or chewed by teeth, or a small piece of meat of chewable size, or just a small substance in general, so not necessarily meat, any substance that is small. In this phase, the embryo resembles a chewed substance, but still bears the teeth marks. The embryo shows the distinct somites which resemble teeth marks in the embryo's body. The second and third meaning of Mudghah apply to the embryo in relation to its size, for it is approximately 1 centimeter in length, the size of a chewable object. Outside surface in alaqah stage is smooth, and in Mudghah it acquires furrows, swellings, and corrugated surface, which gives the embryo the chewed appearance. So here is the claim that he wants to make. So we have to ask the question. Oh, I should point out that he had another blurry picture to justify his claim, very closely resembling the one I have on screen that is not blurry. Not exactly the same, but I found it's the same scientific diagram, different Muslim chewing a piece of gum. So is this true? Well, again, the best we can say is kind of, sort of. No textbook is ever going to describe the embryo as resembling chewed meat or showing teeth marks. All of these things are I'll be generous. These things are imaginative descriptions, but they're not scientific descriptions. They're not the way a scientist would describe the appearance of an early stage embryo. But of course, an embryo is small. That part is correct, and no scientific problem with that. Note also that this picture is gum. He said it meant chewed meat, but this is a picture of gum. I would like to see someone try to leave teeth marks in meat. Not going to work. You're not going to have distinct teeth marks in a piece of meat, so they have to use a piece of gum. And of course, the piece of gum also lets them easily shape it in whatever shape they want. So they just shape it to resemble the scientific drawing they're trying to mimic and say, look, this is proof. It has teeth marks, just like the Quran says. Here is a actual photograph of an embryo that's a couple weeks old. Remember, he said this was days 24 through 26, or the stage starts around day 24 to 26 is what he said. If you take a look here, you can see what the scientific drawing is trying to do. It's trying to show the vertebrae. It's trying to show that the developing embryo, the developing baby, has developed vertebrae at this point. However, when you actually look at the actual picture, you can see how it corresponds to the scientific drawing, but you can see that the vertebrae don't actually resemble teeth marks at all. That they've just chosen this picture because the drawing is not perfect, and the drawing kind of sort of looks like teeth marks, but the actual photograph looks nothing like teeth marks. So it's just deception, I would say, to say that, look, this is what an embryo looks like when, and see, it has teeth marks like this piece of gum. No, that's not how it works at all.
Once I took a gum to speakers going to talk about this. I chew gum and then asked them if they look the same. I put the gum in my hand. It was like, oh, disgusting though. Even it was my own gum, but it was still disgusting. Try to make the point, and then guy says, yeah, they are the same.
That's funny. So our second criteria is it observable? And yes, an early stage miscarriage can resemble a chewed up piece of meat. So I have a warning here. If you don't want to see what a early stage miscarriage looks like, turn away from your screen now, because I'm about to reveal what it looks like. So here's several different pictures of early stage miscarriages, and you can see how it looks like a piece of meat. You can see how, if that's what the Quran's saying, that a human being observing miscarriages could determine that, yeah, this second stage, if you want to call it that, looks like a piece of chewed up meat. So we'll go on.
Just a quick point. Even though these are the description Islam uses for miscarriage, just remember every life is given by God. So today people intentionally want to kill those lives, or sometimes because of the medical problems, those lives are being taken away. Don't fall into the traps of just, not much difference from the chewing gum. There is a life in it.
Yeah, I put back up the actual picture. Notice the actual picture, it doesn't look like a chewed piece of meat, but when it's miscarried and it's mixed with the lining of the uterus, it looks indescript. But the actual baby, I mean, they have real features. This is not just a lump of cells, as abortion activists will tell us. This is a baby with features. This is a human being.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on to the next slide. So it's safe to look now. Is this original to the Quran? Is this idea that a human being, or that this second, third, whatever stage you want to call it, of development would look like a piece of meat? And the answer is probably not. The other sources are more specific. They describe the early stage embryo in more detail. They don't use the exact word chewed. So if we're saying that the Quran says that, well, that particular phraseology is unique, but the idea is not unique. Aristotle writes, the more solid parts come together, the liquid is separated off from it, and the earthly parts solidify membranes form all around it. Some of these are called membranes and other are called choria. Hippocrates says at this stage, with the descent and coagulation of the mother's blood, flesh begins to be formed with the umbilicus. Galen says the third period follows on this, when, as it is said, it is possible to see the three ruling parts clearly in a kind of outline, a silhouette, as it were, of all the other parts. Note that Galen tells you exactly how he's making these conclusions. He says you can see it. If you look very, very closely at a miscarried fetus, you can see that there are parts in it. And that's how he's drawing his conclusion. He's telling you where he's getting it from. He's not claiming that Allah gave him special knowledge. He's saying, I observed this with my own eyes. Finally, in the Garbha Upandas, which is a Hindu text from the first millennia BC, after a fortnight, it becomes a spherical mass. This one I put on here because it has a description of amount of times. Fortnight is traditionally 2 weeks. So pretty close to the amount of time that Sadat said that the Quran is describing. And it actually specifies the amount of time. So the author of the Quran, if they wanted to specify this was at 24 days, they could have done so. But they didn't. The author didn't do that because they didn't know, would be my assumption. But even ancient Hindus had some idea of what the time frame was when a baby was being formed in the womb at different stages of development. Moving on, we ask, does the Quran actually teach what Sadat claims? Maybe a little bit. I'll be generous and maybe it does a little bit. The commentators disagree on the shape of this object. The lump, right? The Quran calls it a lump. They disagree on the shape of this lump, but they don't say anything about teeth marks. That's completely a modern Muslim apologist invention trying to make it look like a scientific drawing. Ibn Kathir says that it's a piece of flesh with no shape or features. Oh, gee, where could he have gotten that idea? Maybe from the Quran describing it as just a lump? Al-Tabri says he doesn't seem all that concerned with what the lump looks like. He just repeats the exact words of the Quran, and he doesn't discuss what it looks like at 22.5 either. Remember that the miraculous claim here was that it visually resembles the way a baby looks in the womb. Kurtubi doesn't talk about the Magaha at 23.14. On 22.5, he says it's a little meat, and he says it is chewed. So that's why I said maybe we can give the commentators a little bit of credit on this one, because Kurtubi does say that it's chewed. So he does actually come somewhat close to the meaning of the modern apologist there. Last question. Is this a lucky guess? Well, the verse is really too vague to say anything unless we allow that it says teeth marks, which it doesn't seem to actually say. But for the sake of argument, we'll pretend that the verse does include this teeth mark idea, and we'll give it a pass on the lucky guess. So given this information and your careful study of the Quran, do you think that this is a miraculous knowledge that the Quran is portraying?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree here and say that there's no miracle, because it's just a vague statement that could be easily observed from miscarriages. And
I just want to express also, like, I am offended by how the very language Muslim apologists or medical doctors, Muslim scholars are using for a life which is in the womb. Reason for that is like that life is meta. And if you describe that life with, oh, it looks like a leech, oh, it looks like a gum, then what do you expect people to do it? Oh, well, I don't want extra gum in my tummy, I need to get rid of it. Oh, I don't want leech in my tummy, I'll get rid of it. I think that's like very offensive language at all for me.
yeah, I would agree that, in their desperation to make the Quran true, they diminish the value of the baby.
Yeah.
Although they're not necessarily out of line with Muhammad there, since he didn't seem to think that the baby became a human being until 40 days.
Yeah.
So, no miracle here, just something that you can observe from careful observation of miscarried babies, as Galen himself says he did. So the next stage is the bones stage, the Islam stage,
So
which
so far,
correspond.
so far we looked at so far we looked at, let's say, I'm kind of putting with the Muslim terminology, sperm, blood clot, uh, lump, and now we are looking at fourth stage, bones.
Yes. So Sahih International it says we made the lump bones. They add from to make it a little clearer. I think that's justified. I mean, I think that the Quran is saying that it turns the lump into bones. It just doesn't include that word that could help clarify it. Sadat writes, the Izam, which means bones in Arabic, the embryo stays in the mudga stage for 6 weeks. In the beginning of the 7th week, cartilaginous skeleton begins to form, and eventually the embryo takes the human shape with formation of skeleton. Bone formation is sequential. He abbreviated something PRY. I think it's a typo though, because that doesn't seem to correspond to any actual medical term. But basically, ossification, the formation of bones, centers appear in the femur in the 7th week, and in sternum and the maxilla in weeks 8 through 9. With this stage, the embryo takes the human shape, and this fact has been verily described in the following hadith. When 42 nights have passed from the time of nutfa, the time of conception. Oh, wait, I thought that was with the sperm drop. He's changed the meaning again. Allah sends an angel to it who shapes it and makes its hearing, sight, skin, muscles, and bones. He concludes, before 42 days, the embryo cannot be distinguished from the embryo of other animals, but at this stage, it clearly becomes distinguishable.
So for 40 days, woman might be carrying monkey or lion or cat or anything. That is nothing makes, according to Islam, you are not human for 42 days.
Yeah, I think that, Muhammad's the best interpreter of the Quran, and that's what he seems to believe, because there's several hadith. Some say 40, some say 42 days, some say 45 days. We'll ignore the slight difference there and say somewhere around this time period. An angel visits the mother, and that's when they make the lump of stuff, right? That's what the Quran describes it as, the lump into a human being, because that's when the baby gets to, it gets its gender, it gets its sight and hearing, its skin, its muscles and bones. Notice that the hadith is actually saying all these things take place at day 42. And the angel comes and it gives all these things. Obviously, Sadat's not going to agree with that because that's not medically correct. But
biblically, I just want to make a point. Biblically, Psalm 139. For you created in my inmost beings. You knit me together in my mother's womb. The moment you end up in your mommy's tummy, you are human being who has value, who's supposed to have value, until Islam comes and then says, well, for 42 days, you're not much difference from the animals. And then after 42 days, I'm going to form you and shape you, and then going to give you body parts.
Yeah. One of many examples of the Quran taking good and correct theology and distorting it and making it something evil. So with that note, we'll ask the question of whether this is true. Here's a picture of what an embryo actually looks like at 8 weeks, just so you know. Kind of looks like a human being, strangely enough. So yeah, his science is more or less fine. Ignoring what he said about that hadith, which is nonsense, that since we're addressing the Quran here, that what he said about the science that he pretended was in the Quran is accurate. But note that he did slip in this deceptive phrase. He said cartilaginous skeleton, i.e. not bone, it's cartilage. That's correct. That's scientifically correct. But that's not what the Quran says. The Quran says bone. It doesn't say cartilage. Skeleton is not actually bone at this stage. And human embryos are distinguishable before 42 days. Genetically, they're distinguishable from conception. Visually, they're distinguishable from within a few days. And just for fun, I have some visual evidence of that. So you have here a human embryo at 6 weeks, and you have a bat embryo at 6 weeks. You can see there's a vague similarity in the shape. I mean, this is just kind of the nature of being confined to the womb. The most efficient shape is kind of curled up. But you see that the bat has distinguishable wing bones here. You can see the kind of the outline of the wing being formed here. Whereas the human being, you can see the outline of little fingers. The hand looks absolutely nothing like the bat wing that is being formed.
How many weeks did you say this is?
6 weeks.
6 weeks. Okay.
Which is 42 days. Or, sorry, 42 days would be 7 weeks. But 7 weeks is when, so I put 6 weeks because he said before 7 weeks they're not distinguishable. So
yeah, and also helpful to remember. So it's supposed to be just bones according to Islam. All that white thing you are seeing shouldn't be there at all. We should have only the bones.
Yeah, this is here's the actual human being, and then this is the placenta, which is feeding the baby.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So are the bones observable? So yes, again, a close examination of a miscarried baby of sufficient age will show there's bones. You can, not to be too graphic, but you can cut it apart and you can see that there are bones inside the miscarried baby. Here are some in utero X-ray ultrasounds that show the baby having distinct bones developed. They're not, strictly speaking, they're not bones. They're cartilage that will turn into bones. But you can see that this is taking place. This is something that a human being could see with careful enough observation, even without a microscope.
How many weeks is this pictures from?
I believe that the first one is going to be around our time frame of 7 weeks. Okay. And then the other one is a little bit more developed. As you can see, the baby doesn't yet have legs at this earliest stage. Legs form later on.
Yeah.
So then we have to ask the question, is this an original idea? Did people know from before the time of Muhammad that babies developed bones? Well, since our article is ignoring that the Quran claims that the lump turns into bone, we're going to have to ignore that as well and only phrase this, did people know that babies had bones? Which is obviously yes, but I'll go ahead and quote some specific sources to prove that. First, in the book of Job, we have a poetic description of the formation of a human being. Remember that you formed me as if with clay. You will return me to dust. You poured me out like milk and pulled me together like cheese. You clothed me with skin and flesh, and inside me did you interweave bones and sinews. Very similar idea of the Quran. Now, this is clearly poetic. This isn't a scientific claim about the development in stages, but it is very similar to the Quran's description, right? You have the lump, which is interpreted as flesh by Muslim commentators, and then you have bones being interwoven among the flesh. Hippocrates says the bones grow hard, moreover they send out branches like a tree. So he is more detailed and more correct than the Quran here. in that he is understanding that some bones, like the vertebrae, as we saw in that very early picture, start forming much earlier, and then other bones kind of, they don't really grow out of it like a tree. But the point being that he's correct that the bones form at different times. It's not one event, the formation of bones. Galen is even more similar to the Quran, but I'm leaving that to the next section because it's a perfect description of what the Quran says next. Does the Quran teach it? Well, we'll give Sadat this one, that the Quran is declaring that a baby has bones. Ibn Kathir says we gave it shape with a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs, and its bones, nerves, and veins. So he's taken the one word of the Quran and of bones, and he's turned it into all the different bones in a human body. Fair enough, I think. Al-Tabari doesn't discuss the bones, except that he talks about a textual variant. Yes, the perfectly preserved Quran with no textual variants, right down to the letter, has textual variants according to Al-Tabari, who discusses them in his work. Kurtubi says gives the same hadith that Sadat does as kind of an explanation of this Quran verse, but doesn't make any other comment on it. So again, Muhammad's supposed to be the best interpreter, even better than Kathir, Al-Tabari, or Al-Kurtubi. So, we go to his interpretation, and he says all this takes place at day 42 when an angel visits and turns that indescript lump into an actual baby. So does this go beyond our guess? Well, since we've had to ignore that the Quran inaccurately claims that the lump of flesh turns into bones, all it is saying is that bones are formed at some point, which is patently obvious. Babies are born with bones, so they have to have bones form at some point. So yeah, you don't need to guess that. That's just common sense. Oh, sorry, I forgot to ask whether you felt that this was a miracle.
No, I didn't felt that was a miracle at all. I heard miracles like virgin gives birth. I heard miracles, everything is being created out of nothing, but not such a miracle. No.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to agree. I don't think you need any divine knowledge to know that a baby who's born with bones has bones forming at some point in its development. Sadat ignored that the Quran actually says that the bone is formed from the lump, which is usually interpreted as flesh. Flesh does not turn into bone. That's completely inaccurate. So all we're left with is an easily observed fact that's you don't even have to observe. You can easily observe it from miscarried babies, or you can just use your brain and say, yep, babies are born with bones. They had bones develop. So stage number 5, corresponding to the Quran words, we covered the bones with flesh, which is the laham phase. Sadat quotes the Arabic here. He says, laham al-kisa bil laham, clothing the bones with flesh.
Sorry, so far, as the 4th stage we already looked at, flesh wasn't there. So now flesh is stepping in. So all these things we saw, they were without, it was just like, what do you call it? Skeleton? It was just a skeleton.
Yeah, well, I think that we take the Quran seriously. So we have a single drop of sperm. Then that sperm turns into a blood clot. Then that blood clot turns into a piece of meat. Then that piece of meat turns into a bone. So all we have at this point is some bones, and then those bones are covered with flesh. That seems to be the sequence of the Quran.
Okay.
So Sadat writes, we have already seen that skeleton is formed in the 7th week, and the differentiation of muscle starts in the 8th week. In other words, myogenesis takes place during this stage. Development of definitive muscles starts in the trunk, and the fetus starts moving. The muscles take their position around the bones. The sequence of events is very fast, as mentioned in the Quran. And then he explains what he means by that. He says the use of fa, an Arabic conjunction, which means rapid sequence of events. The Quran states the fact as then, fa, we clothed the bones with lam, muscle, flesh. The passage also indicates that the Lam stage represents the end of embryonic tachlic stage, which is followed by the Nasha phase. The conjunction thuma, also meaning then, indicates a slow sequence with a time lag between the two stages. So my understanding, and I do not speak Arabic, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is this is not even correct about the Arabic here, that they both mean then, but it doesn't really correspond to a period of time difference.
So
What?
that
Go ahead.
word like it goes like and then. So there is like that then word is there in Arabic.
Yeah, I think there is some distinction between the two different thens, but not what Sadat's claiming. But we'll give him that. We'll it's his description. We're only evaluating whether his description is scientifically accurate, not judging his Arabic, even though I think it's a highly questionable claim. So first we have to ask if it's true. Before we do that, note that this picture here relates to this stage, but it also relates to the previous one. The baby at 10 weeks there, everything in blue is cartilage. It's not yet proper bone. It hasn't yet turned into proper bone. And you can see by birth that most of the cartilage has turned into bone with the exception of joints, basically. So keep that in mind. This is at 10 weeks. He's saying that at the previous stage, week 7 to 8, that bone had been formed. Now he's saying this is a different, distinct stage, but he's actually playing fast and loose here because he says it's a different stage. He says it occurs after, but if you read his description, he says that the bone forms at weeks 8 to 9, which is a little generous. It mostly forms after week 10. It does begin to form around week 8 to 9. But now he's saying that this new stage, this clothing and flesh, takes place at week 8 because, well, they're taking place simultaneously in reality. So he's technically correctly given the science by saying that they occur at the same period, but he's done it very deceptively. He's said they're distinct stages, and he's not said they're happening simultaneously. He's just said week 8 and 9, so that you don't notice that he's actually correctly stating these form simultaneously. So is it true? Well, it's not true that they're distinct stages. It's not true that the one takes place after the other. It is true that muscle forms at this particular time in development, but muscles don't take their place around the bone. Myoblasts, which are the precursors to muscle cells, are, if you want to use the words of Sadat there, taking their place around the cartilage, the precursor to bone, as both are transforming into their final form. So it's not about muscle forming around bone. It's about a precursor to muscle forming with the precursor to bone. So the science is really not good at all on this stage. I think this is probably the worst stretching of the science that he does. So would this be observable? Well, yeah. I mean, really what the verse is saying in this particular verse is saying that bones are covered with flesh. It's saying that in somewhat poetic language, but it's saying that bones are covered with flesh. Is it observable that later stage miscarried babies have skin and flesh and muscle and bones? Of course it is. Plus, a baby's born with those things, so they obviously have to develop at some point in time. Thank you, Trinity Matrix. Very humorous comment. So is this idea original to the Quran, that flesh forms around bones? Of course not. Earlier texts contain not only this idea, but very similar wording. We already saw the words of the book of Job, which sound similar to the Quran. I'm not going to assert that the author directly copied the book of Job, but it's not impossible either because it describes skin and flesh around bones and sinews. Now, on the previous slide, I said we'd get to Galen, and here he is. Thus, it has caused flesh to grow on and around all the bones. It made in ends of the bones ligaments that bind each other, and along their entire length is placed around them on all sides thin membranes called peristyle, on which it caused flesh to grow. So Galen, in much clearer terms, describes what the Quran is said to describe, that flesh is forming, or muscles are forming around the bones. Galen seems to think that this is what occurs, and I'm guessing he's not a prophet of Allah, so he gained this knowledge by some other means, probably by using his eyes. Does the Quran teach it? Well, if we're going with what Sadat said, the tafsir don't seem to have any knowledge of what is covering what. They talk about the covering. They don't seem to actually think that it's muscle or skin. They seem to think that it has some metaphorical, mystical interpretation. They think it's describing like some grandiose thing, but they don't seem to have any knowledge of muscles forming around bones, interestingly enough. Ibn Kathir says, we gave it something to cover it and strengthen it. So he's just talking in very generic terms. He's saying that the bones needed a covering to protect them. Al-Tabari just repeats the exact words of the Quran. He doesn't have any commentary to add on those exact words. And Qurtubi has some strange, bizarre saying. He ties it to the bones specifically, but I think he's really describing the whole passage, and he's saying that the passage is a description of how one's lineage happens, how one is related to their ancestors. And he metaphorically is tying that to the formation of bones. Don't ask me why, but that is what Qurtubi decides to do. Last question for Bones, is this a lucky guess? So, if we're going to say that the verse means that muscles are formed last, as Sadat does, keep in mind we're actually only at day 40 or so. The baby's nowhere near completely formed, but Sadat's going to say that this is the last stage of development because it's the last thing the Quran says. Well, again, could be in any order in principle, so we'll call it a pass on the lucky guess criteria because we're not evaluating the truth of it, just whether it's a guess or not. So, given what I've said about this one, do you think that this is the best scientific miracle we've seen yet, or do you think it's just another total disaster?
Another disaster and double disaster. Even I know more than him, or more than out of the Quran, and already people express like you are much knowledgeable than the Allah in this topic. So that I think already identifies this as not a miracle at all.
Yep, I have the same thought. Sadat, first of all, he played a game to hide that this isn't really another stage, even in his own interpretation, that he's hidden the scientific air of this being a later stage than the formation of the bones, since they're happening simultaneously, not sequentially, as the Quran says. It says then. He tries to get around this by saying, it's using a then that's really rapidly. It's basically the same time. No, it's not. It's then. It's after, which is incorrect, scientifically speaking. But even ignoring that, this saying was previously found in other texts, and at least if we take the tafsir seriously, they don't seem to actually be talking about muscles anyway. It seems to have some metaphysical, mystical interpretation of that flesh is used as an analogy for the whole person as opposed to muscles. So this is usually this is where the Muslim apologist ends it. They just ignore that the baby hasn't actually been formed yet. A baby born at this stage would have minimal chances of surviving outside the womb. There's a lot of development still to take place. They usually just ignore that since the Quran doesn't say anything else. But Sadat comes to the Quran's rescue. He invents a new stage. He calls it the growth stage, the Nasha phase, which corresponds to what's probably just the summary of the Quran, that's summarizing that the baby's been formed. When it says, then we developed him into another creation. So after the sperm and the blood clot and the lump of flesh and the bones and the clothing of flesh, then if we're taking this as a stage, then after all those things, then Allah makes the baby into an actual creation.
It says like another creation, another than human being.
Yeah, and
another than lion, another than cockroach.
well, when we get to the tafsir, we're going to see that they actually really struggle with this. They really can't figure out what the Quran means, and it's probably because of that exact word. They don't know what another is doing in there. They're like, what do you mean he formed another creation? He already formed the creation, right? When he gave flesh to the bones, that's when he formed the creation. So what does it mean then he developed him into another creation? And there's probably around 10 to 15 different guesses that the tafsir make as to what this is supposed to mean. The perfectly clear word of Allah, the tafsir have no clue whatsoever what it means. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's look at Sadat's claim first. So he states that the growth stage, the word nasa in Arabic means to initiate, to grow and develop, to rise and increase. This phrase begins from the 9th week to term and is further divided into 2 stages. So remember, we're only at the 9th week of creation from what the best Muslim attempt to make the Quran into an accurate description of embryology could only take 9 weeks. There's still a long ways to go. Term is about 40 weeks, so we're only a fourth of the way there, and the Quran's out of information. But no worries, we're just going to project the rest of the development over 30 weeks into this one word of growth. He writes, attaining the definitive human form, the first stage is in Nasa al-Khalqin. This stage begins from 9 weeks until 26 weeks, and during this stage, there's a rapid growth and development. Second stage is Hadana Ramana, uterine incubation. This stage begins from 26 weeks to full term, 40 weeks by date. The Holy Quran has explained with precise definition and elegance this stage of intrauterine development, and the meaning of Nasha applies clearly. This meaning to initiate describes the initial functioning of various organs and systems. The second meaning, to grow, indicates the rapid growth and the development of various organs. The third meaning, to rise and increase, describes the very rapid and obvious increase in fetal size and weight. Therefore, the term Nasha clearly and accurately describes the fetal period. For support for his theory, I guess, he cites Surah 39:6. He makes you in wombs to your mothers in stages, one after another, in 3 veils of darkness. He then writes, the 3 veils of darkness may be referred to as the anterior abdominal wall, the uterine wall, and the amniochorionic membrane. The interpretation seems to be the most logical from an embryological point of view. With grace and elegance, it has been described in the Holy Quran.
I think in Islam, definition of grace and elegance is different.
Yeah, well, Allah put in one word, and then because he only put in one word, you can, of course, match this up. That just means growth, and obviously the baby grows. So, it's extreme elegance that he simplified all of this detailed development of the baby down to one word, which is growth. But notice that he kind of gave away the game here. Before I go on, I want to point this out. He says the interpretation seems to be the most logical from the embryological point of view. In other words, I'm starting with the knowledge of what embryology teaches.
I'm starting with logic.
And then I'm looking at the Quran and deciding what the Quran means. I'm starting with truth, reading the truth into the Quran, not getting truth out of the Quran because it's not there.
Versus, I remember a Muslim missionary at Speaker's Corner said, like, don't use akıl, use nakıl. So don't use logic, just go for it. This guy is using logic and trying to make sense of unlogical things Allah is stating in the Quran.
Yeah, I mean, Allah seems to think that the baby is fully formed around the period of 9 weeks, just like Muhammad seems to think that an angel comes and gives the baby all its features. It described his ability to see and hear, and those are things that develop well after 9 weeks, incidentally. And, also his gender or her gender and the bones and everything else. It all forms what this one exact time. That's what Muhammad said. It's what is compatible with the Quran, but no worries. It says the word growth, so that can be anything. So, is it true? Well, yes. I mean, the baby grows. So, of course, Sadat has just inserted the actual science of a developing baby and imagine that the single word growth contains all that information. Is it observable? Well, I mean, obviously, the baby is growing. You can see this. The belly's expanding. The baby comes out much larger than the size of a sperm. Later stage miscarriages are larger than earlier stage miscarriage. It's observable. Is this idea original to the Quran? Well, do I really have to cite text to prove that people knew that babies grow in the womb? All right, fine, I will. So Hippocrates says, as the flesh grows, it is formed into distinct members by breath. Aristotle says, it is expedient for the safety and growth of the fetus that no weight should be upon the uterus. Sadat himself admits that Galen knew this, because he writes in the paper that I've been reading from, it is not known when scholars realized that human beings were developed in uterus. I would say it is known. Probably the very first human being realized that. Anyway, Galen in his 2nd century AD had described the placenta and membranes in his book. Oh, so Sadat, you want to admit that Galen knew this in the 2nd century AD. Well, thank you for proving that there's no miracle.
Yeah, while Allah reveals, so Galen knew this at 2nd century AD. Allah reveals this to Muhammad 5 centuries after people know about it. Yep. And then today's Muslims identify this as miracle. Why? Because Muhammad wouldn't be able to know this very basic information, which he didn't get to know well, but anyway.
Yep. So, yeah. No miracle here. If we're pretending that this word growth means everything that Sadat says, well, Aristotle said it grows, Hippocrates said it grows, Galen said it grows. Sadat even admits that Galen knew this. So, yeah, they taught this before the Quran. But does the Quran teach it? And here, as I already alluded to, the answer is no. And the tafsir don't know what the heck this verse means, but they make, 10, 15 different guesses. The one thing they never ever guess that it means is everything that takes place from the last stage of development that the Quran actually describes to the time the baby's born. They don't allow that possibility, and it's probably because the tafsirs know what Muhammad said, and they know that Muhammad thought that all of the development took place at a single point in time when the angel visited. So Ibn Kathir guesses that this means that, quote, we breathed the soul into it, and it moved and became a new creature. So this is speaking specifically of Allah turning the on-living, non-human being into a human baby by breathing a soul into it. That's what Ibn Kathir believes. Al-Tabari gives a whole bunch of different opinions. Like I said, the scholars can't figure it out, so Al-Tabari, in his usual fashion, just quotes them all. He says it might mean that a soul is added, like Ibn Kathir says. He says it might mean that a spirit is added, which is slightly different. He says it might refer to all that happens after birth. After birth. Not that this isn't even part of development. This is what happens after the baby is born. Or it might refer specifically to the drinking of breast milk and other activities of infants. Or it might refer to the development of hair. Or it might refer to the development of character. Or it might be a summary. Like this is just a summary statement that the Quran makes about the things that had taken place prior, and it's not conveying any new information. Qurtubi, like Al-Tabari, gives a whole bunch of different opinions. Some of them are the same, some of them are different. He says it could be the soul, so this is the one that all three offer as a possibility. He says it could refer to the specific act of being born, coming out of the uterus. He says it could refer to hair. He says it could refer to teeth and hair. He says it could refer to the perfection of youth. I don't know what that means, but he means something by it. He says that it could refer to the development of intelligence-related traits throughout life. And this phrase growth could refer to everything that takes place from the time a baby is born to the time they die, specifically around intelligence-related things that are one of the marks of being human beings. So the tafsir have no clue what it means, but the one thing they say it doesn't mean, or the one thing they don't offer as a possibility, is the one thing that Sadat claims it means.
So that is only one verse, and they don't know what it means. And in that verse, there are words no one knows what it means, but in somehow it is miracle.
Yep. Yeah, this is the actual miracle of the Quran, if we want to call it that, is that it's so vague, it means so little that you can just imagine whatever meaning you want into the text. So does this go beyond a lucky guess? And well, if the verse just means, as Sadat claims, that development continues, I guess from muscles, that's what he left off with, until birth, and obviously there's no guess needed. A baby's born fully formed, so it obviously developed at some point. So this is our last of our major claims by Sadat. So I'll ask you again, do you think this is some kind of special knowledge here?
No.
And I agree again. The meaning of the verse is quite unclear, as the tafsir indicate. They don't know what it means. I don't really know what it means. My best guess might be that it's supposed to be a summary, but as you pointed out, Allah stupidly inserts the word another, which makes it very confusing because you don't know what he means by that. So the verse is unclear. Anyone can read whatever they want into it, and that's all Sadat did. So he took what he knew from medical science, pretended the verse says that. However, we do have this side claim of the three darknesses. It was just a minor aside in Sadat, but I have heard this advanced as an independent scientific miracle by other Muslims. That it's a miracle that Allah knew that there's supposedly 3 layers between a baby and the outside world. So is it true? Well, yeah, Sadat admitted that it was true when he said that it was the logical meaning of the verse because of his knowledge of embryology. However, it should be noted that the 3 layers he picked are just arbitrary. There are actually many different so-called layers of the human body. There are a whole bunch of layers just in the skin alone. You could pick multiple different layers of the skin alone. So you could pick whatever number of veils you want, but the Quran says 3, so you pick 3. Strangely, even though it's perfectly clear, the Muslim apologists can't agree what those 3 layers are. They all agree there's 3 layers. They all agree it's a miracle. They all cite different layers. They don't know which layers Allah is referring to, but they know there must be 3 because that's what the Quran says. So is this observable? Yeah. If you cut open a pregnant animal or even a non-pregnant one, let's say the animal's already died. Let's say you're not killing an animal to do this. It died from natural causes. You want to figure out how its body works. You cut it open. Hey, you can see that there's multiple different layers between the skin and the uterus. Not something that you need divine knowledge to pick. So regardless of what you say these three layers are, you could observe it by the dissection of animals or human beings. Dissection of human beings was generally considered improper to do, so ancient humans didn't do that very often, but they certainly had no problem dissecting animals. Is the idea original to the Quran? And this one I'm actually not certain about. I did find people saying that Galen taught this, but I couldn't find a direct quote from Galen. That he taught that there was 3 membranes around the uterus. I couldn't find the quote, so it's possible that it's only attributed to him by later authors, and he didn't actually, or that we don't have it in his extant writings. We don't have everything he wrote. So that doesn't mean he didn't say it. It just means I couldn't definitively prove that he wrote it. And then this picture here is what I thought was a pretty cool looking picture of ultrasound type technology. I forget the exact name of the technology, but it's showing that there are kind of 3 distinct layers of the uterine lining. Now, remember, Allah said there's 3 layers between the baby and the outside world. So if there's 3 layers in the uterine lining alone, that wouldn't correspond. But I thought it was a pretty neat little picture, and that's what Sadat claimed. He claimed that it's specifically these 3 layers. So, does the Quran teaching? Well, not Sadat's interpretation. The tafsir all agree there's 3 layers. They all teach basically the same 3 layers. And so, shockingly enough, they teach the 3 layers that would be most easily observed in ancient times. They teach that the 3 layers are the abdomen, the placenta, and the uterus. Ibn Kathir doesn't actually comment on that particular Quran verse. Al-Tabri says it's the abdomen, placenta, and the uterus or womb. And Al-Qurtubi says that it's the abdomen, placenta, and uterus. Or, he, as he likes to do, offers a different interpretation that is metaphorical. He says it's the placenta, the womb, and the night. Or, this would also be metaphorical for a different reason: man's back, woman's belly, and the womb. Now, why would Qurtubi think that the man's back is one of the 3 layers that a baby goes through as they develop? I'm asking that question to you, Hatun. Why do you think that Qurtubi would say that?
Because of the Quranic verse where the semen comes from?
Yes, I would think so. I think that's what Qurtubi thinks. You know, he's saying that, well, there's 3 stages of development. It's the very early stage where the baby is a sperm being formed between the man's backbone and his ribs.
Yeah.
And then there's the second stage where it enters the woman, and then there's the third stage where it develops in the womb. I think that's what he's guessing.
Yeah, my practical problem with this is, especially this 3 layers, 3 darkness thing, is like, what is it with like 3, you know, like first thing when I hear like number 3, only verse I think is like, do not say 3, do not say 3, God is one. And then they like focus on this 3 so much to make sense of do not say 3, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And I'm sure everyone watching is aware, but sperm does not actually form between the man's backbone and his ribs. That's just a different scientific error of the Quran.
No, brother, you need to be careful how you verbalize that. For normal human beings, okay? Maybe for Muslim people, it is different. Maybe that's how it is with Muslim people. Maybe like for Muslim people, that's where the sperm comes from, your backbones and ribs.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be. It could be one of those miracles of Allah, that he forms non-Muslims and Muslims in a different way.
Differently. Yeah. Yeah, there is, remember, there is a hadith talks about um how Muslim body is Muslim stomach is different than the non-Muslim stomach.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. There is. So there you go. There you go. More evidence that the formation of a baby is different in Muslims than non-Muslims. So just wrap this up. Does this 3 darknesses go beyond a lucky guess? Well, in theory, there could be any number of layers in a human being, and in fact, there are far more than 3 layers that are distinct. So, yeah, if you pick the exact number of 3 and it was correct, that would be more than a lucky guess. So this is my final question for you, Hatun. Do you think that this one goes beyond a lucky, or do you think that this one is a miracle? The 3 darknesses.
Well, number 3 associates with Trinity, and darkness associates with light. So Isaiah chapter 8, it's all darkness and then light comes to shine into darkness. So in that sense, I can see biblical stolen of theology, but with Islamic sense in context, actually, it is not miracle at all. Sorry, brother.
No, it's all right. I'm just going to have to agree with you again. I mean, you got it right every time. That the observance of layers could be easily done in the 7th century, and the choice of 3 layers is completely arbitrary. You could have picked any number, and you could have given layers to match to that. So, yeah. Nothing miraculous here. I don't have a slide, but I did want to make one other comment on Sadat's paper. He, after going through all this and making these stages, he then makes this additional claim that the very fact that the Quran has stages is miraculous, that no human beings had the idea that babies developed in distinct stages before that time. To give it away, one, the authors did say that. Galen talks about development in stages. Aristotle talks about development stages. I think every single text talks about development in stages. 2, it's false. There are no distinct stages of pregnancy. It's a continual development process from the moment of conception to the moment of birth. It's a continual process, and for that matter, after birth as well, continual developmental process. There's no point where the baby is not developing. There's no point where you can create a distinct stage. Any terms used in textbooks to describe stages are for convenience, because in reality everything's happening simultaneously, everything's developing. There is no real division. It's just a completely arbitrary distinction. So the very fact that the Quran divides it into stages is yet another scientific error, if we want to be strict about it. So I have one final slide, and that is how Muslims should respond to this. And for here, I'm actually going to suggest they follow the example of Hamza Sortzes, who is a Muslim apologist even. In October 2011, Sortzes published a 58-page paper. So you thought that the eisegesis here was ridiculous. Sortzes published 58 papers, all on Surah 23, explaining how this embryology was miraculous, going into insane levels of detail, quoting source after source, for definitions, for scientific things, and so on and so forth. After he wrote this paper, he was very proud of himself. He thought that this was the greatest thing ever. So he spent 6 months engaging with atheists. He took his paper, he went and talked with actual atheist thinkers, not just random people, but actual atheist thinkers. He went to atheist conferences. He went to atheist meetings. He tried to talk to atheists, convince them that because of the miraculous embryology of Surah 23, that there was a God and that that God was the Allah of the Quran. Because he was engaging with actual thinkers, he got responses. And he kept having to revise his document because he got science wrong. He was pointing out that his conclusions weren't justified by
So you
his
mean like
argument.
he was abrogating his 58 pages as he was engaging with atheists and learning the basics? That was abrogation was taking place.
Yes. He was abrogating his original argument, trying to make a better argument. He revised his document 4 times. It ended up being 78 pages long. Started at 58, ended up being 78 pages long. And then he gave up. He went silent on the topic. He eventually deleted it from his website. 2 years later, he wrote a paper to Muslims telling them to stop with the scientific miracle nonsense. He wrote in the paper, regrettably, the scientific miracle has become an intellectual embarrassment for the Muslim apologists, including myself. He went on to claim in that paper, which was arguing to Muslims to stop using these arguments because they're bad, he said that he had met many apostates who, when they found out that the scientific miracle claims were frauds, that it caused them to leave Islam. His exact words, a significant number of apostates from Islam, many of whom I have had private conversations with, cite the counter movement's work as a causal factor in deciding to leave the religion. So because Muslim apologists are making these ridiculous nonsense claims about scientific miracles in the Quran, people discover that those claims are lies, and then they realize, hey, probably other things that I'm being told about Islam are lies as well, and they end up leaving Islam. Now, sources didn't live Islam. He didn't go far enough, right? But he does have the right attitude about these scientific miracles. If a Muslim wants to tell me that the Quran doesn't contain any science, that it's metaphorical in its apparent scientific claims, I would have some dispute with that. I would say that some of the things the Quran says do seem to be actual claims about the physical world, which are factually inaccurate. However, I'd be a lot more comfortable with them trying to defend that position than trying to defend this ridiculous nonsense about scientific miracles in the Quran. So I would say to the Muslim, give up this argument. If Islam's true, you don't need it. If Islam is true, you don't need to pretend that there's scientific miracles in the Quran. It should stand up to historical scrutiny. It should stand up to moral scrutiny. It should stand up to logical scrutiny. You shouldn't need to point to advanced scientific knowledge if your religion is actually true. The fact that you do point to these things, the fact that this is pretty much the most common argument made, at least within the Islamic world, not so much to the outside world anymore, but at least within the Islamic world, this is one of the most common arguments made, shows what poor ground you're actually on, because this is, in fairness, there have been Christians who've tried to claim the same kind of thing about the Bible. They've tried to claim that the Bible contains advanced scientific knowledge. But did they get anywhere making that claim? No, because Christians don't need to make claims about scientific knowledge in the Bible. We know it's true on its own right. We don't need science to tell us the Bible is true. You, by telling me that the Quran is true because of scientific miracles, what you're saying is science is the judge. Science decides whether something is true or not. And I'm sorry, but science tells me that the Quran is false. So those are my closing thoughts to the Muslims. Get rid of this crappy argument and find a real argument for Islam. I don't think you're going to have a lot of luck finding one that actually works, but maybe you can find something. But don't rely on this obviously false narrative of scientific miracles.
Thank you very much, brother. It was very helpful. I think one thing I become more convinced is, well, baby in the tummy of woman has a value and dignity as a baby. Even though Islamic scholars, Muslims are just using very, very inappropriate terms for that life. God gives life, God takes, and God gives value. And we are like, God created us wonderfully. Such as I find that was very disturbing. The certain terms, as I was hearing from you, how Muslim scholars are describing baby and life. Even you are just nobody for 42 days in the tummy. That's all disturbing, very much disturbing. So I really appreciate. Sorry,
No problem.
that was Jibril. Jibril was stepping in. Um, so when you I'm guessing you already used this argument with Muslims. Has any Muslim ever pointed out to you that uh, one of the reason they shouldn't be using this argument, because that is not the argument Quran itself presents. Like, the reason Quran is the word of Allah has nothing to do with the scientific miracles. Like, somehow just kind of that end up in Islamic Dawatim today. But has any Muslim ever pointed out to you that actually this is not the argument used by early Sahabais or anything?
Well, not in that, in specifically response to the scientific miracles. It does seem to be the argument that Muslims are most allergic to is the one that the Quran offers for itself. No one wants to defend. I mean, it comes up every once in a while. Every once in a while, a Muslim will say that the Quran is too beautiful to be written by a human being, that you can't imitate it. But they don't really seem to like that criteria, which is very telling since this is the criteria that their God gives for them. If their God didn't give it for them, I guarantee no one would ever come up with that criteria. Let's put it that way. It's pretty ridiculous, and it's Allah's best criteria. He doesn't tell us anything about scientific knowledge or that he obviously he wouldn't use those terms, but he could say something like that. He could say, in future generations, you will find knowledge in this book that you didn't know existed, or something like that.
Yeah.
He doesn't do that because he doesn't know there is any of this advanced knowledge, and it's not actually there either.
Well, some people identified you as much more than Allah. Maybe there are some Muslims who also know much better than Allah. Therefore, they use such arguments. So, brothers and sisters, watch out for that stupid argument so that you can simply just use these materials. Brother, I really appreciate for all the materials and all the information you shared with us. We will be putting in practice and then asking very basic questions to Muslims. Before I kind of finish, I'll just want to kind of summarize something for us. As a Christian, yes, today Muslims might claim that Quran is the word of Allah because it contains those scientific miracles or other miracles. I think for us as a Christian, especially it's December, we remember every day, but this time of the year we more focused. We need to remember bigger miracle. We need to remember actually it is the triune God who created universe out of nothing. Triune God created universe out of nothing. It is the word of God who took up human flesh. The Son took up human nature, become God man. A virgin give birth to the Son of God. That's miracle. We don't need anything else. We've got another amazing miracle. Eternal Son of God who took up human flesh, gave himself on the cross for humanity, and on the third day, he walked out of that grave. That's a miracle. Not how babies look like chewing gum or something. That's not a miracle at all. Lord Jesus Christ, he himself is miracle, and then he invites us to be part of it. Just whatever kind of comes into your mind, remember the most important miracle. That's the most important miracle we have. God man conquered that grave. That grave is empty. He waged war against death. He waged war against all the darkness. Walked out of that grave. That's a miracle. And who did that? Triune God who created universe out of nothing. So for me, that's a miracle, and that helps me to be more confident that we've got a miracle which we can tell people. We don't need to kind of figure out, oh, what is the definition of that word, and then write essays and then come up with like, or it might be this, or it might be this. So I'm grateful that you made me to be more confident about that, brother. So thank you so much for that. Have you got something is coming up next couple of weeks that we can bring people's attention to your channel, or you are up to something, brother?
Yeah, so I started a series looking at racism in Islam, where many of us are probably familiar with some of the sayings of Muhammad that sound rather racist. However, that's just scratching the surface of it. When you look into early Islamic history, you find Muslims describing people from Africa, black people, as being property, as being inferior, as being hated by Allah. You know, the kinds of things that are normally associated with America's history with slavery, you find Islamic sources saying the same kinds of things 800 years prior. So I'm digging into those sources now. Had part one.
Sarah studied lots of research and studies on the colorism and slavery in Islam. So you might find some of her videos helpful as well.
I'll definitely take a look at those. But when we look at this material, so part one, we looked at just the hadith. We just looked at the words attributed to Muhammad. Already looking really, really bad, really hard to justify his own attitudes. And then we look at the history of the Islamic slave trade and whatnot, and we see that people took his ideas and they used them to justify their dehumanization of people from Africa.
Okay, so that's for December or for coming days?
Yes, that will. I haven't set an exact date yet, but that'll be in December at some point.
Okay.
And then the other video that I'm working on is a video about Andrew Tate, where I interview Too Many Marys, a regular contributor to my channel, where she plays the part of a Muslim woman reacting to the conversion of Tate and finding out that he actually does represent Islam pretty well, and thus being disgusted and leaving the religion.
Okay, well, we will keep eye on that. Is there anything brothers and sisters can pray for you?
Yeah, so my wife has a chronic pain condition. We got some good news this month. She was scheduled for a trial of a medical pump. I don't know the precise name of it, but basically a pump that continually administers drugs. The trial went very well, so she's now she's been scheduled for surgery to make it permanent. She had relief for pain for the first time, significant relief for the first time in several years with that. So keep praying for her in that regard, and also pray for my ministry. I've been having a lot of good talks with Muslims recently, a lot of people who are not trolls, who are actually thinking, actually looking for answers. And those are always good. So pray for those Muslims who are seeking, and pray for me, guidance for me as I have conversations with them.
Great. Thank you very much, brother. And once again, thank you very much for the information you shared with us. And we will be remembering you in our prayers, as well as we will keep eye on what you are up to do in your channel. By God's grace, probably I will see you before end of the month anyway. And thank you very much, everyone who joined us in the chat. By God's grace, we will see you on another live stream or at the bosom of the Father. God bless you, and may Christ crucified silence you with his love.